are some red fruits in the set here, but there are fewer than green fruit, and so on. So that kind of uses like this course layout. This particular technique, radial sets, also has these histograms where like the fruit here are of only in this set, but not in any other set. The fruit here are in at least 2 sets, and the fruit here is in 3 different sets. That works fairly well, and of course also is like something that we've seen, that I've seen in the solutions. Some examples here, like that's actually fairly close to an original radial set. Here's a different kind of layout where this, well, this is maybe more node-link layout actually, but this would be an example that uses this instead of on a like circular arrangement, on a linear arrangement. And this is kind of related, but actually a little bit more closer to parallel sets. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit about this matrix-based techniques that we developed. That's kind of like also, but that was developed really with the idea of the banana Venn diagram, like making that kind of problem better to do. So the goals are, like, we have these kind of like inefficient visual encodings if we, for example, use Venn diagrams. So instead, we want to use efficient visual encodings like bar charts. And then we also wanted, like when we created this technique, we also wanted to be able to create complex slices of data sets. So we wanted to say, hey, what are the properties of all pairwise intersections taken together, or any other combination? And then we wanted to be able to visualize attributes about each of these intersections efficiently. And so this is kind of like what we came up with. I'll use a movies example here, movie genre. So we have action, comedy, crime, drama, thriller, romance, horror, science fiction, war, and mystery. And then we can see the overlaps in here, the visualization of the intersection. I'll talk about this more in detail in a second. Then we visualize the properties of these intersections. And then we also visualize individual elements in those intersections and attribute details about the elements in these intersections. So let me kind of like introduce it from the bottom up. So the basic idea here is that we, instead of representing like the sets as circles or any shapes or something like that, we represent them as columns, like A, B, and C. And the bars here show you how big those circles or the sets actually are in the first place. And then we have like a simple encoding here, like must and must not for the matrix. And then we start off like, the first here is the like empty set, where we have not A, not B, not C. The second one here is A, but not B, not C. And then we can correspondingly keep growing it like not A, B, not C, not A, not B, C, and then combinations thereof. Here we have A and B, but not C. What we do here is we draw this little line here. That line essentially tells you that we want you to read this horizontally, and the vertical relationships are not particularly meaningful. So that kind of like emphasizes the connectedness is in this direction, it's not in this direction. And then correspondingly for A and C, and for B and C, we have, and then finally the 3 set intersection A, B, and C. So what's nice now is we have kind of like a matrix that identifies each of these intersections, and then we can very easily plot the cardinality of each of these intersections. So now we have like a very quantitative approach to that, and we can clearly see that 20 is bigger than 17, even if we didn't actually label it. So the nice thing about this is that I can also easily plot attributes now. I can actually visualize like what are the things like how surprising is the size of an intersection. Because if you think about this, how big an intersection is also depends a lot on how big the 2 constituting sets are. Like if we have, let's say documentaries, there's way fewer documentary movies out there than there are dramas, for example. And kind of like the overlaps kind of depend on that. And so this is kind of a statistical measure that we use to show how big would you expect a particular intersection to be given the set size and the random distribution of elements in the sets. So that would here mean essentially that the second row is actually fairly big, but it's smaller than expected. I could also ask what is the distribution of an attribute in an intersection. So that could be things like ratings of movies. We can plot that with, for example, box plots here. And this is where I talked about, when I talked about box plots versus violin plots, where I talked about sometimes you want to use box plots because they're very compact. And that's one of those cases because we're drawing a lot of box plots. So here's an actual demo of this tool. You see comedy, drama, all of these different genres here. Then we have the cardinality. You see, like when you hover, all of these highlights. And then you can sort by, well, okay, let's first take a look at some of the patterns we see here. So we have an intersection here that's between comedy and drama. And that's actually fairly big, like it's actually the biggest two-set intersection, but as you can see here, it's smaller than we would expect. And kind of intuitively that makes sense because comedy and drama doesn't really go together. Like most movies are either comedies or dramas. Still, there is a couple of movies that are, or a lot of movies actually, that are both comedies and dramas, and then we ask ourselves the question, why is this the biggest two-set intersection? And if you look at the data, it's actually because comedy and drama are by far the biggest sets that we're looking at. So we expect to see a lot of them. We are actually seeing a lot of them, a lot less of them than we should be seeing if this were like random or things like action and comedy that go together well. Another thing that we can see here is like what the value of these attribute visualizations is. So for example, here, the first bar here shows us the average rating of drama comedy, and you can see that the average rating, there's a lot of spread, but the average rating here is fairly high. Compared to action comedy, the average rating is fairly low. Again, not particularly surprising, action comedies are not usually high-quality movies. So we can use sorting to answer more specific questions. So for example, which is the biggest intersection? We can simply sort by cardinality. Or we can ask what is the most surprising intersection and sort by deviation. So like in the system, this is what this looks like. And you've seen this when we did our own homeworks with the tables. So these kind of sorting operations allow you to ask specific questions. And sometimes we can do direct manipulation. For example, when we want to sort by specific set or by cardinality, we can directly click on the corresponding column. But for some things like sorting by degree, there isn't really a good way to directly click in the interface, and so we have to use user interface widgets. Now, this was just like basic intersections, but we can now also aggregate those intersections in some meaningful way. So for example, I could ask a question like, are many items shared between two sets? And to do that, I could simply aggregate by degree. And so what I do here now is I introduce new rows that represent these aggregates. So we have, the first one here is degree 0, then we have degree 1, and that is kind of corresponds to the blue area in the Venn diagram. That's kind of the sum of all of the children that are of degree 1. Then I have degree 2, which are all the green parts of the Venn diagram down here, and then degree 3, which is the one part in the middle. And then I could ask questions like degrees is one way to aggregate. I could also ask a question, how are the elements of B distributed? So instead I could aggregate by set, so that I see all of the intersection of B close to each other and also the summary of all of the elements in B. So I start off with A here, then I continue on with B, and so on. So a couple of things are noteworthy here. First, we have introduced a new visual encoding. These little dots in here, like, okay, well, the answer for the question is, how are the elements of B distributed? You can simply look at that. So that's the answer to this question. But a couple of tricky things here. So first, we've introduced a new visual encoding. Remember, we had this binary must or must not contain. Now we introduce like a may, kind of like we don't really care, like a question mark in regular expression, right, or a star in regular expression. May occur or may not occur. And then that kind of allows us to also visually encode what we mean by that. So it must be in A to be in this aggregation, it may be in B, and it may be in C. And the other thing that we have here, because we kind of like have the same like aggregation and individual items on the same scale, we often get things like that these bars get very long and flipped. We could use a log scale here, but that kind of makes it tricky to see differences in the individual ones, and so we did what we call horizon bars. So we cropped the bars and wrapped them once around. And that works up to 3 times. that works fairly well. Up to 3 times like more, it gets tricky. This idea, like we've seen this for line charts when we had these horizon graphs. And then the other thing that we note here is that we have duplicate elements. Like these 2 green highlighted ones here appear, of course, both in the A and in the B aggregation. And then finally, because of those duplicates, we can't actually fit as much anymore on the screen, and so we have off-screen content. Of course, we can scroll to that, but we can also simply aggregate and collapse like each of these sets individually. So we can, instead of looking at the individual in a section, we can just look at these aggregates. And so that's how this looks like in the system. We switch from degree to set-based aggregation, and now I see all of the comedy movies. You can see quickly that comedy by itself is the biggest one, and then comedy drama is the second biggest one, and so on. And then you can group them, and then we can do 2-level aggregation too. So here I'm now showing all the overlaps between 2 genres. So all of the action-drama combination is shown in this bar here. All of the, well, this is actually comedy-drama combination. The comedy-action combination is here, and so on. So the last thing is you can use this actually, these kind of visual encoding to like write explicit queries by using this must, may, and not idea. And so we could say, I care about all the elements that are definitely in A, are definitely in B, and maybe in C. And that would be like a query that I can formulate. And the result for that would look like something like those. Those 2 intersections match that query. And in the system, we can do things like, and you can also see there's like a natural language interface for that. It must be an action-adventure movie, and I don't care about all of the others. We have 6 movies that are in that category. Okay, so let's look at some specific examples for elements and attributes. How do documentaries compare to adventure movies? Is a question that you could ask with a tool like this. So first we see that documentaries don't really mix too much. It's like there's some crime comedy documentaries, but mostly documentaries are by themselves. If we compare that to adventures, we can actually see that adventures mixes a lot. If you want to see what the specific documentaries are, we will see that down here in that table. And if you want to look at the attributes of the selected documentaries, we have different visualizations that are linked in this multiple coordinated view system. What we have here on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis we have the rating. And so what we see is that we have a cluster up here. Most of the documentaries are fairly recent, and most of the documentaries are fairly highly rated. If we then add adventure movies, we see the big spread. There's many different genre combinations. And then we also see that they tend to be, like there have been adventure movies from the beginning of when we made movies, essentially. And then what we also see here is that we have a lot more spread in quality in recent years. But we have this tail here. Like it looks like there were really no crappy adventure movies back in the 1940s. Why do you think that is? What's that?
People were easy to please.
Easy to please is one theory. But this data set is, of course, collected in the internet age. Her?
No special effects.
No special effects? Yeah, other ideas?
We forgot about all the bad ones.
I think that's it, right? We don't go back to like adventure movies from the 1930s that were really terrible. We forget about the bad ones. We only remember the good ones. And if we start rating in 2010 or 2008, then we have, of course, a bias towards good movies in the past. So whenever you have something like that, you have to be aware of these kind of like data collection effects. So this is wide applications. We have built an R version of this that you can simply use with your R data frames and then plot that. We've seen this a lot in life science papers. People just use the module and plot the intersection between the data. we've made some modifications for like print compared to interactive screens. Like the biggest one being that we flipped it over, because on paper, like in a figure, you usually have more space like this than like this, and you're not able to scroll. And then we have different types of attribute visualizations, basically to work better with print. And then we have, of course, redesigned the banana chart. And so this is the banana chart redesign. Remember, this is like 6 different plant species and how many genes they share. And we couldn't really tell much about the data in the original 6-set Venn diagram. But if you look at this plot here, we can fairly quickly see that all of those plant species share more than they don't share. So the biggest intersection is the intersection of all of them. The second biggest intersection is of those 3 here at the bottom, and the third biggest intersection is of those 5 here. So we could kind of reason that this one here, this is the date. We could kind of reason that the date is possibly evolutionarily similar to any of these other plants. We have to be a little bit cautious because the date also has the smallest genome. This is the kind of analysis that we can easily do with this representation, which would really be hard to do with the banana-style Venn diagram. And some people actually have designed this in their exercises, and so here's one of those examples. There is a lot of other options. This is a setvis.net. That's kind of like a literature collection based on a state-of-the-art report by Bilal Al-Shalak. And they classified all of those techniques and provide references to the individual papers and to the source code if it's available and so on. So that concludes my set lecture. And now we're going to move on to best projects, unless anybody has questions about set visualization. Okay, best projects. So how does it work? What does it mean? Let's talk a little bit about that first. So we had a 3-hour meeting yesterday where we looked at most of your videos. The way it works is first every TA looks at every single video in their group, and then each of the TAs nominates 4 to 5 of their best projects for us to look at as a group. So that means we looked at roughly 20 projects. So like we have, let's say, a team size of 3. We looked at about the projects of 60 or 50 to 60 people in this room yesterday in a 3-hour session. We meet, we watch all the videos, and then we also play with all the tools and discuss which one gets a nomination. And then from the nominated ones, we pick the top 3 projects. And that works by like every TA and me, we each get 3 votes to distribute as we see fit. So we could like give 3 votes to one project, or we could distribute them amongst different projects. And from that, we pick the best project. And this year, we picked a single best project and 2 runner-ups, which we didn't rank. And then we have a number of honorable mentions. So we have a first place, 2 runners-up. Those get chocolate, every member of the team. Less importantly, you also get 120% of all the possible points. The 7 honorable mentions get 110% of all possible points. And all of those are listed in the Hall of Fame on the website. I should say, for like a little bit of caution here, this applies to the project, right? Your individual grade might vary depending on your peer feedback situation. So if you, like, doesn't necessarily mean that this is exactly your grades, but usually for 97%, this is the grades are uniform. Okay, let's start. The honorable mentions, I should mention in no particular order. Our first honorable mention is Trade Wars by Jacob Osterloh, Oleg Korshak, and Avram Twitchell.
Decade visualization. Our purpose for this visualization is to be able to zoom in on a single country and understand its international trade relationships, where it exports to, where it imports from, and the different products that it exports and imports. We allow the user to select a country using the drop-down box, So for example, we can select Australia here, or we can use the world map to click on the different countries. In this example, we'll be looking at Brazil. Over here, we can understand Brazil's ranks relative to the rest of the world for different products and the volume. We can sort it and see that Brazil exports the most of crude materials, and its top exporting destinations are China, Netherlands, Japan. And we can see for imports, it imports the most for machinery. We can see where it imports from. We can also see how it ranks with the rest of the world. So here we see that Brazil ranks number 3 in the world with crude materials. And if we go over here, we can see that it's just behind Australia and the United States. Over here, we have the world map, and it functions as a heat map. We can see where Brazil is exporting to, and we can also filter by imports and see where it's importing from. We can see it's largely the United States and China. And then down below, we can see over time how Brazil's exports and imports have changed. So for example, in recent years, exports and imports have both been going up quite a bit. We can also filter these other charts by selecting a specific category, product. For example, here we select food, and we can see that their exporting destinations change quite a bit. Instead of China and the United States, it's mainly Russia. And we can see that Brazil exports quite a bit more than imports in terms of food. The user can also select which years they want to focus on by clicking on these dots. And they can scale volume by population and see how the country ranks.
Okay, so we really liked this project because we had the options like for deep explorations were really great. So if you guys here, can you stand up? Thanks. Okay, our next honorable mention goes to oil and gas geochemical data visualization to aid exploration by Pablo da Pambolina and Skylar Schuh. Are you guys ready? Look at the video.
This is a brief demonstration of our data visualization project, U.S. oil source rock data exploration. This visualization is meant to be a vehicle to explore and analyze source rock data without imparting biases on the audience. In short, as mentioned in the topical panel here, drilling for oil and gas is expensive. And because this is such a niche field, it is encouraged that you briefly look at the information in the About page to better understand what some of the measurements and charts are trying to convey. On the main screen, we have a map of basins. Hovering over a basin will tell you what samples associated with it. Clicking on a basin will drill down into it, taking you to a second screen. A basin can have many formations that can be explored. Within a formation, many wells can be drilled down into to extract samples. Currently, these 4 charts are all displaying samples from the Carbondale Formation. Clicking on an individual well will highlight the samples in that particular well. Multiple wells may be selected at once. As you can see here, all 4 charts' contents will change accordingly to the sample selected. Hovering over a bar or a particular point in any of the graphs will reveal specificities via a tooltip. Over here, we have the Van Krevelen chart. It explores the kerogen types of the samples. Type 1s are more likely to produce oil, 2s oil and gas, 3s gas, and 4s are inerts, meaning that they are unlikely to produce anything. The inverse Van Krevelen also conveys the same kerogen type information, but also tells us how mature a source rock sample is.
But also because it has these super rich linking and brushing features. Okay, our next honorable mention is Visualizing Error in Material Informatics by Yuheng Yang and Stephen Cowie. If you hear wave or stand up or something like that, so we know. Congrats.
This tool was inspired by the need to incorporate chemical intuition and exploration when evaluating machine learning models that are based off of material properties. So the first thing we have here is the periodic table. This is the hub for most interaction. It allows the user to quickly explore the chemistry involved in the actual versus predicted values that are generated from the model, and an ETSME chart, which is generated from the features. features are generated using the chemical formula, which is based off of the elements. So if we look, something like fluorine upon hover, we can see that fluorine has high experimental values, and we can see that fluorine is clustered in the TSME chart. We can hover over whichever element we like, and if we want to select one, we simply click. If you want to select two, you click on another one, and you can select as many elements as desired. You can also click a second time to remove the elements. You'll notice that as elements are clicked, they're all aggregated into a residual plot showing you the distribution of the selected item. The TSME chart also functions to show us not just the residual values, but the band gap values. You can very easily see clustering here. If we want to explore that further, we use the brush, which shows us the average residual for all elements that are selected. The ability for the brush to grow or shrink allows us to check as broad or as small of clustering as we would like, giving us a better understanding of how chemistry is involved in this process.
Okay, again, another system that we
This
really
tool
like.
was inspired.
That we really like because of the custom visuals, like the periodic system of elements here, and the rich interaction with linking and brushing. Next runner-up is Digital Marketing Paid Search Clicks by Thomas Vega. I should say that the data here is particularly meaningful because he anonymized all of these search terms to Latin words. When you actually see it with real search terms, it makes a lot more sense, but still a cool technique.
Hey, this project is about looking at the data of paid search clicks, so clicks on search results that advertisers pay for. Search engines like Google and Bing collect this information and give it to the advertiser so that they can do their analysis of how successful an ad or ad campaign is. For this project, I'm looking at a very small subset of this data for a specific advertiser. All this information is obscure, but it still shows the interesting aspects of the data. Mainly, I wanted to see if one can discover patterns in all the searches across the US. Patterns like popular keywords or combinations of keywords or search phrases. I experimented with different visualizations, and this is the result of what I think worked best. On this page, we can see on the top left a map of the US with each state colored. The color represents different metrics, either the total clicks or the clicks per capita. So I can change this to the clicks per capita, and the visualization changes. Below the map is a word cloud which shows the popular keywords. The bigger font means more clicks. The color is an indicator of the profitability. In the center, we can see the force-directed graph, which shows how the keywords are connected to each other through co-occurrences within the same search phrase. Hovering over keywords shows its links with other keywords. The width of the link indicates the number of co-occurrences. Here we can see keywords that are highly connected, or other keywords that are in isolated groups. On the right, we can see a list of all keywords in descending order. The bar graph shows the number of clicks. Hovering over the keyword highlights the corresponding node in the force-directed graph. Clicking on the state map breaks this down to the state level. On the state level, we can see the cities where a keyword was clicked on. In order to get more information about the visualization itself, the help icons provide some details in the power. Thank you for watching.
Okay, we like this one because it really also allowed us to drill down deep into a data set, kind of wasn't quite as obvious with the Latin words, but you could really see patterns. For example, Adobe Reader is always searched together with download. Nobody just wants to learn about Adobe Reader. It's really just about downloading. Next runner-up or honorable mention is NBA Game Tracker Viz by James Brissett and Chris Hadway.
For the visualization class at University of Utah. This is our NBA game tracking preliminary visualization tool, and this visualizes NBA games. As we start the main display, you see that the main display is a 2D court with an abstract representation of the ball and players, actually playing a real game of basketball, in this case the Utah Jazz against the Warriors in 2016. As we hover over every player's name on each side, you notice that they're highlighted on the actual court, so you can track players. And as you select them, two things occur. First, they're highlighted in blue for perpetuity, and their previous visual information is displayed as a heat map. This allows you to extract player trends and proclivities very easily and intuitively. And you can turn this on for several players, allowing you to see player trends in relation to each other intra-game, which is very valuable. You can compare it to opposing teammates or opponents. Now, as we scroll down, we see that our initial selection of Klay Thompson is actually reflected in the lower visualization as well. And this lower visualization shows broken down stats, 8 different stats for all the players, separated by team and then sorted by size, with some nice hover functionality which gives you the actual stats. So, for example, Draymond Green had 15 field goal attempts. And as you highlight him, you see that, oh, cool, I can keep it going on, and I can see that he got 15 points as well. Now, on the bottom left, you see a nice visualization of Klay Thompson, a little personal connection with this picture. And as you click this toggle, you're actually dropped into a force-directed graph visualization of passing data. So all of these links are passing links throughout the game. And as you play with it, you can get a good understanding of who passes to who. And this is a visualization. Thank you.
Yeah, we really enjoyed that because it has all of those custom visuals and really allowed you to drill down into a game. Okay, our next honorable mention is Taxi Rides in New York City by Zheng Wang and Shishua Du.
Is a group of Zhong and Yishua Du. Our project is about the taxi rides in New York City. The main view, as you can see, is the map chart to show the corresponding supply and demand in different zones. And we can set a filter here. We can set date. And the start time in the day and end time in the day. And select different cap types and data types and apply the filter, and we can get a different view of the map. And by hovering on the different zones, we can get specific zones information. And by click the zone, we can fix the information panel, and you can see there is a supply demand chart and revenue component chart, the pie chart and the revenue in different times. And by click the zone again, we can cancel the selection, and we can also use right click to multi-select the zones. And after finishing selection, we can click the chart button to show the comparison charts between different zones. And the first one is about the match numbers in different zones, and the second one is about the revenues in different zones. And the third and fourth chart are about supply and demand in different zones. Trade and the core chart is about the trades between different zones. And that's all about our final project. Thank you.
Okay, so Our next honorable mention is Crime Landscape of Salt Lake City by Rashid Ratour, Josh Gangrad, and Rebecca Munkeri.
Hello. In this project, we have tried to build an interface to explore the crime landscape of Salt Lake City. Using publicly available police cases data from 2008 to 16 for the Salt Lake County, the web interface allows us to interact with different aspects of the data and derive insights from it. The visualization is divided into three coordinated views: the map view, the selection view, and the statistics view. The selection view consists of a simple form with checkboxes to allow selection of a subset of crimes that the user wishes to visualize. User can choose to visualize only one or multiple crimes. Hovering over the checkbox shows a tooltip with a brief description of the crime. The views are updated when the user clicks on the update button after making the selection. The donut chart shows the contribution of each individual crime type to the total crimes in the active year. The map view shows a full map of the Salt Lake County and surrounding regions. The map is created using Leaflet library, and the map data is fetched from OpenStreetMaps API. The currently selected crimes from the selection view are rendered onto the map for the year specified by the year slider here. The map supports panning and zooming. The home view shows an aggregated count of the number of crime incidents in built regions using a hierarchical clustering available in the mapping library. The map supports semantic zooming. Zooming in re-aggregates the data based on regions shown in the current map viewport. Clicking on a node also zooms into the corresponding region. At the highest zoom level, the individual incident can be inspected and the information is displayed in a floating pop-up. The map has an additional overlay here that allows quickly selecting and deselecting the rendering of particular crime types without reloading the data in the selection view. This year slider can be moved to show data from a particular year. All other views are updated according to the currently selected year. The data for each year has more than 50,000 points, and the views can take some time to update. The statistics view shows the trends in the selected crime types. The yearly statistics show the number of crime incidents over the years. The monthly view displays the trends for various months of the active year. Weekly and hourly stats show the same information on their respective aggregation levels. The plot support excluding plotting by toggling the crime types in the legend. Hope that this provides a better understanding of the crime landscape in your neighborhood. Thank you for watching.
Okay. This was really cool because we could really drill down into individual incidents, and it was very relatable for us, and lots of cool linking between the different charts. Okay. Now for our first runner-up. Again, no particular order. Income Inequality in the United States by Jared Nielsen and Brian Park. Congratulations. Anyone here in this group? You get chocolates. Congrats.
Income inequality in the USA has been a hot topic for a while, but we've decided to look at the history of it. Has it always been as bad as it is today? Once we accumulated our data, we decided to dive deeper into income versus wealth, the racial disparities in income, as well as a few other features. Let's get started. Here's our landing page for our visualization. On the left, we have income by the years, and on the right, we have a share of $10,000 for any given year by category. Categories are pentile of earners, as well as the top 5, which is a subset of the highest. Interactivity helps highlight specific portions of the graph. On the right, we have data that shows a normalized version of the distribution of income for a selected year. We also have a short story that the user is able to flip through that points out some of the highlights of our visualization. For example, the huge disparities between the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class, as well as the federal poverty line. We also allow the user to use a brush selection to select the time period and categories. The absolute wealth between them is then displayed for the user to see. Moving down with the Martini class approach, we expand the options for the user to select exactly what data they want. For instance, racial data as well as the time period. Here we can see major discrepancies in race, as well as how the problem gets worse over time. Moving down, we can see our wealth display. This displays the wealth distribution over the last 100 years or so. Similar to above, we use a story stepper that highlights specific points on the timeline that might interest the user, as well as tell a story. They are then free to explore any time period they want using this time slider. This display clearly shows how far the middle class has shrunk in the last 50 years or so.
Congrats again. We really like this project for the clear storytelling and the way you're really faceted it into different things and didn't use super complex visuals, but really made great use of those that you used. Okay, then we have another runner-up. And this is Call of Data by Alex Fisberg, Heidi McKay Bishop, and Michael Fenn. Congrats.
Upon entering our tool, users will be shown a landing page, which affords the user two options: learn more about Call of Duty and Call of Duty in the realm of esports, or go directly to the visualization. We will remain exhaustive throughout this demonstration, thus we will choose the option to learn more about Call of Duty. The user is now presented with text that explains Call of Duty and Call of Duty World League. On the final page, the user is now presented with three options: Hardpoint, Search and Destroy, and Capture the Flag. Selecting any one of these presents the user with text explaining the gameplay. When the user is finished, selecting the X in the top right will close the explanation and take them directly to the visualization. Near the bottom of the screen is a timeline. On the vertical axis seen on the left-hand side of the timeline, the different teams are listed, and on the horizontal axis at the bottom, the different CWL tournaments are listed. If a team participated in a tournament, a white circle is placed across the team in tournament. Lines connecting circles indicate contiguous tournaments that the team played in. Users can select team names, tournament names, or a circle representing team's participation in the tournament to update the visualization. First, we will explore what happens when a user selects a team from the left-hand side of the timeline. The view changes to include a horizontal bar chart on the left and text information on the right. The horizontal bar chart shows the difference between games won and lost for a team per tournament. A negative value indicates that a team lost more games than they won. A positive value indicates the opposite. The text information on the right lists the team's roster. The number of tournaments a team member participated in are displayed to the right of their name. If the user selects a tournament at the bottom of the timeline, a bracket for that tournament is displayed. You'll notice that there are two brackets, a winners and a losers bracket. CWL is based on the double elimination paradigm. A team must lose 2 matches to be fully eliminated. To view highlights of the tournament, a user may select the View Highlights button. Finally, if a user selects a circle for a team in a tournament, a star plot will be displayed. The star plot presents team statistics for the different game modes in the tournament. For one particular team, Evil Geniuses, we created a short scroll-telling narrative that shows how this team was able to almost be eliminated from competing in subsequent tournaments at the professional level to winning CWL champs. To view this narrative, the user must click on the team name Evil Geniuses or Team Caliber, and then click on the play button. Upon clicking on the play button, users will be presented with the narrative. At any time, the user can click on the X in the top right corner to leave the scroll-telling and navigate back to the visualization page. If at any point while navigating the dashboard the user is confused, an info icon has been placed in the top right corner that will lead them through a short walkthrough of the UI. The user is able to go back to previous steps, continue on with the next step, or close out the walkthrough at any time.
Okay. So yeah, amazing storytelling, a lot of different views that all work well together. And then finally, our overall winner this year is Arctic Explorer by Dylan Wooten and Ethan Ransom. Congrats.
Thanks.
Welcome to Arctic Explorer, a tool that lets users look at temporal and spatial trends in sea ice concentration. In the Explorer mode, the tool displays global sea ice data. On the map, you can see the concentration of sea ice, with white representing high concentration and dark blue representing low ice concentration. The line chart on the right is used to explore how the average concentration of sea ice has changed over time. Clicking on this specific data point updates the map to display the state of Arctic at that point in time. Throughout a year, this concentration can vary rapidly. To investigate trends in this chart, users can filter the data to be displayed using a heat map to the bottom right. The heat map lets users brush to filter the dates displayed on the line chart. We have two presets for analyzing how sea ice concentration has changed over time, September and March. As you can see, the average concentration for September has decreased significantly since the 1990s. September is considered an important month by researchers because historically it is the yearly minimum for sea ice extent. If you're interested in a custom query, such as seeing how the concentration changes over a particular year, you can highlight all months and select that year. We worked with sea ice researchers in creating this tool, and they expressed interest in being able to explore the status of important routes through the Arctic. To investigate this, users can switch over to the navigation mode, which allows for them to draw a path on the map. Points along this map are interpolated, and their corresponding concentration values are displayed in the new concentration map. The y direction on the chart corresponds to the distance along the path, and by hovering over a heat map cell, you can see more information, such as the location and concentration value. Clicking on the cell renders that one's data. This is the view of the Northwest Passage, which first opened to ships without an icebreaker back in 2007. This passage has extreme international importance as it can be used as a shipping route. It can keep ships from needing to travel south to the bottleneck of the Panama Canal. Along this path, you can see how ice concentration was low enough in 2007 for ships to pass through without icebreakers. The other preset button shows the sea ice data for the Northeastern Passage. However, you can always draw your own shipping routes by interacting with the map directly, clicking to paste a point and dragging to change a point. Finally, you can also click delete on your keyboard to delete the selected point.
Okay, congrats again. This was our best project because there was just so many different things going on, all of them really nicely integrated together, totally custom visuals, new techniques implemented, so really great job. Thanks guys. Great, so now let me just we'll do like a 10-minute wrap up for the whole lecture. I want to do a bit of a recap to kind of close the loop and think a little bit back on what we have all done in this whole semester. So my goal was to get you to learn 3 different things, right? The theory, that's what I'm basically doing in lecture. Design skills, that's what we're doing in all of these different exercises and the critiques. And the coding skills, that's what we're doing first in the coding homeworks, in the coding lectures, and then in the homeworks and the projects. And we hope to kind of allow you to integrate all of this and then basically make you awesome visualization designers. So we talked about things like what is a good visualization. I hope that everybody in this room now is able to really tease apart, not only intuitively is this good or bad, but really also argue why something is good or bad. Because it's not really actually an art. There's a little bit of a craft to creating visualizations, but it's really based on scientific fundamentals. And so you should be able to tease those apart and really like analyze a visualization in the future. You should now be able, like, who's not a better web programmer now? One person who is not a better web programmer, but I'm assuming that most of you now have really like dug into the web stack a little bit. We talked about things like perception, and like we call things like color blindness, pop-out effect, and also the natural limits of the human visual system, and that this kind of like is all that the foundations of everything you do in visualization. So we talked about the basics, like the data, marks and channels, work, the different data types, how like that there is different like quality channels for different data types. Talked about Stevens' psychophysical power law as the like underlying theory of why there is a difference between those channels. And then design guidelines. There is like reasons of not doing 3D pie charts like that. But you probably remember that it's not a bad idea always to have chart chunk, right? If you can communicate something better with an illustration or with something interesting with good design, why not? There is no strict rule against that. We talked about interaction, how we can leverage interaction to really tease out information from data sets that would otherwise be too big. We talked about how we can use multiple views and linked highlighting to also explore different facets of very large data sets. We talked about small multiples and partitioning and think between same and different views, all of those things. The next section here is going to be exam relevant. I just put in this little highlight here, but everything else was before the fall break. We talked about tablet data visualization. Remember that we have like access-based techniques that don't need a lot of algorithmic support, and then we have things like heat maps that need clustering and ordering or seriation to be actually useful, and then we have these very abstract representation like multidimensional scaling or principal component analysis, where we only see global trends in data sets. We spend a lot of time talking about maps. The kind of the gist here that I want you to remember is don't always use a map if you can. Sometimes it's better to not use a map, especially if people are familiar with the geography you're talking about in the first place. You probably have, like all of you probably remember that Mercator is a decent map for looking at the city level, but you shouldn't use it if you look at the world map. We talked about graphs a lot, differences between explicit graph, link layouts, matrix layouts, and implicit graphs, such as tree maps and icicle plots. We talked about filtering and aggregation, how we can use clustering, what the differences are between histograms, kernel density estimates, box plots, violin plots. We talked about a couple of specific clustering algorithms, kind of how they intuitively work, and some multidimensional scaling, and then problems of area partitioning and grouping by area, where we dug a little bit into things like gerrymandering and Voronoi diagrams. And then finally, we talked about text visualization. Jen talked about text visualization, and then today about set visualization. And so this is a very broad set of things, and I hope it was interesting for you. We also talked about storytelling, which I think is like a very important skill, and it kind of noticed probably that the top 3 projects all had good storytelling components in there. Then we talked about how we design visualizations and how we evaluate visualizations in like one brief lecture. There are other lectures that would dig more into this. I'll point you to those soon. And this is just like something, a quote that I really like by Jaak van Wijk about like the value of visualization and about how to evaluate them. He says that the added value should be obvious. Developing new methods, interfaces, and software that are so compelling, awesome, cool, impressive, fascinating, and exciting that reviewers, colleagues, users are totally convinced just by looking at your work in some examples. It's kind of his evaluation strategy, which I kind of like subscribe to in many cases. So what are other, like if you found this class here interesting, what are some other opportunities that you could follow up on? So there's the visualization seminar, which has a course number, but you can also just attend. It's Wednesdays at noon in this building on the 3rd floor. There is free pizza. It's also a mix between the topics that we talked about in this lecture and the topic that we'll talk about that Chris Johnson will talk about in the This for Scientific Data course. So we kind of cover both sides of visualization in that seminar. There is going to be an advanced data visualization course that's being taught by Bei Wang, and she's looking at large graphs and geometric methods, but I would refer you to her syllabus for details. And then there's kind of like the complementary course to this one is This for Scientific Data, which is going to be offered next semester. Like 2 years ago, these two used to be in this one course, and then we split it up into 2 different courses because we think A, we have like 7 or 8 visualization faculty and correspondingly many students, and B, we kind of really want to give each of those sub areas of visualization its proper space. And so This for Scientific Data is going to be about all the field data sets, things like MRIs, things like fluid flows, or geometries, and so on. So that's a little bit more, let's say, like generally 3D, a little bit closer to computer graphics. If you're interested, we are also taking on students to do independent study projects. I've already had a couple of people ask me, and so how does this work? Is usually that I pair you up with a PhD student to work on a project because I just simply get too many requests to do this individually. But if you're interested in that, that is an opportunity to develop something like your final project in a research environment. Here are some other courses that might be interesting. There is CS6540 HCI, which is offered in the fall. Then there's an advanced HCI class, which is mostly like a methods class, like how do we do qualitative research, how do we do quantitative research, and so on. And then these other classes are all relevant for the newish human-centered computing track. Things like Intro to Statistics and Research Design, Product Design and Development, Ethnographic Methods, Introduction to Research Design, Human-Centered Computing Seminar, and so on. And so this particular track has a lot of interdisciplinarity built in, so you can actually take courses for credit from other departments more than in most other tracks. Okay, finally, I would like to ask you guys for some feedback. We have a couple of minutes left, so I just want to put up the slides. Just raise your hand. Were your expectations met? What worked well? What didn't work well? Did you like the balance of how the points were distributed? Did you like the projects? Anything like that?
As a full-time grad student, this is my last semester in my master's. This course was really hard to mix in with a full-time
Job. Yeah. So basically, you're saying it's a lot of effort to write this class.
Yes. A bit of fluff. Yeah, I just want to say, I didn't really have any programming experience before taking this class, so thank you to all the TAs for their labs and help and everything like that. That was really helpful.
Thanks.
I really like the in-class design critiques, and I wish other classes would do similar things.
Okay. It's kind of always feels weird for me, is it worth spending 20 minutes on these kind of things? But I feel would you agree, or should I just talk more?
I agree.
Okay. And did you like the project?
Yeah.
Or more homeworks would be better?
I kind of like how you just have the progression of you want to do once they have to leave taken away. But because I felt like every time you complete the project, it wasn't like we were just starting. Just like the practice, I thought it was really good.
Cool.
It'd be great if there were more design critique tasks built into some of the homeworks, or homeworks focused just on kind of the homework. So you'd be forced to learn those skills early on.
That's a good point.
Just along with the homeworks, I did like them, but the kind of releasing Sunday night and having them be Friday, my classes are usually at night, being the whole time employee. So it's really hard to get valuable time to work on those Monday through Friday. So Saturdays and Sundays are my time where I've been programming and work all day, and I have a fresh brain to work on things.
Okay, so, but I think we at least gave you.
The first 4 were released on a Sunday and evening, while the other one was still open. So it was kind of a very Monday through Friday to work on this on Friday.
Okay. So basically, more time is for
Just they could be released on the same Friday before, so you have a weekend to work on as opposed to like just with the 1 week ones. The 2 week ones are fine because we're usually given like languages.
Yeah, we'll take care of that. We try to do that. Sometimes we like also don't get it done. Creating a homework like this, Jen can probably tell you, is a lot of work. It's a lot more work than actually doing it.
So along with the homeworks, they're really useful to help teach like these basic implementations. Towards the end of the year, when we stopped having homeworks, we also stopped giving examples for like more advanced implementations. Now, I'm not saying I want homework on those, but it'd be really helpful to be able to reference some code that you guys, like professionals, have written in order to take care of some of those.
Yeah, that's a good point. We were always thinking about should we go deeper into web stuff, right? And into how do you build things. But then at some point we felt like we need to make a little bit of a trade-off and not make it all about web development. But we definitely will revisit that and maybe do some more advanced JavaScript stuff and so on, maybe even in the second half of the semester. Okay, more comments?
I was just curious, did you guys think about integrating like R or Python or like other languages?
We did, and I did try that before. And the problem is that people who are not like necessarily core computer science students, like if you throw multiple languages at them in one course, like I'm not gonna like do that. That's why we don't ask you for services.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just wrap up. Please evaluate the course. This is important. We kind of like I'm being evaluated based on your evaluation. Like I might not get tenure if you all give me terrible grades. So I hope that only the people who really hated the course are going to evaluate, but that everybody evaluates the course. So please take 5 minutes to evaluate the course. And then thank you guys. I think you were great. Everybody here participated a lot. I really enjoyed teaching. Thanks Jason Risi for giving guest lecture, and especially thanks to the TAs who did most of the Well, have a great winter break, and good luck on the test.
It was a lot. So, yeah. Great job. Great job. Sorry, forgot. Yeah, I can help with that. Like pattern syntax. Pretty helpful.
Well, that was kind of what I was wanting to see. Like, I would love to go ahead and maybe like take that and something, maybe like sit down with you. So that's how I was like, talk about some stuff because like I feel like you know a lot of like modern JavaScript that I should know that I don't know. So if you maybe wanted to chat.
Sure. Yeah. Pattern syntax. We had very different styles. Like. I would like straight up recommend pattern syntax, but a lot of it's just kind of the stylistic choice.
I mean that one clearly makes much more sense and it improves functionality than this that.
Yep. No, it's kind of a meme or that equals this. Great job on like.
So, are you definitely I don't really know what to do. I think like but I think where you are in the phase.
You should look and see what that is. You probably said it. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. Write an email and look at your case, but I can't comment anything more. I think sorry about that. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sometimes it's not else, right? That's what makes it easy. I don't know if you want to do that before or after. So if you wanted to like try to go ahead, there are like a few bugs that I still like have inside of the beginner mode that is like the map doesn't, the plot doesn't automatically, and I want to change around some things with that. So I don't know when we're halfway through.
So it's sort of very so like,
And how is that? It's the same as you did too, because like they had to decide for one turn.
First like little bit
About like line structure, how they.
I'm doing
Oh, wow.
So,
university. Although I'm actually like super sorry.
I would say like
very good.
Right. We get a chance.